and welcome to a special Earth Day edition of the Smart Life podcast. I'm Jess Hadley.
And I'm Natasha Leiden.
We're marking Earth Day 2026 at a bit of a turning point. We've just seen the latest UN resolution on water security, which, for the first time, formally links global freshwater health directly to economic stability. It's a significant shift in how the world views water, no longer just a natural resource, but the foundational infrastructure for everything we do.
Exactly. Whether it's the pressure of rapid urbanization or the shifting demands on our agriculture, the business as usual approach to water has reached its limit. We're at a point where sustainability isn't just a corporate social responsibility goal, it's essential to our future.
The good news is that while the challenges are scaling, so are the solutions. Today, we're joined by two people who are moving faster than the policymakers, using data, technology, and commercial strategy to fix the systems that are under the most strain.
We have Gert-Jan Maasdam, partner at Blue North Partners, a leader in scaling high-impact water technology, and Paul Reig, founder and CEO of Bluerisk, who specialises in translating complex water data into clear, actionable strategy for the world's biggest organisations.
Gentlemen, welcome to the show. We've touched on the big picture of the water landscape in 2026, but we'd love to hear about the work you're doing on the ground.
Gert-Jan, starting with you, could you give us a bit of your background and tell us how Blue North is approaching these preservation challenges?
Definitely. And first of all, thanks for enabling us to put the spotlight on water. A topic that I became very, very passionate about over the last 30 years, where I had positions, global roles in R&D, business development, as well as market strategy for one of the largest water pipe manufacturers in the world. And in that period, I got extremely, impatient, if you like, on the speed of the transformation that so urgently needed. And it made me very, very curious how to find groundbreaking ways to solve our water challenges. And that's exactly why I decided to fund my own company, Blue North Partners. And the way we try to approach the water challenges is actually a very simple one. Step one is to select the best technology in the world and the best innovations in the world on climate and on water. Secondly, help them to break through and scale fast. And step three, with anything it takes. And that can be funding, because most of those innovators need funding for growth. And that's definitely helping them to get access to projects and clients. And that's where Paul and I started our global collaboration.
And Paul, you've been at the centre of water risk data for a long time. Tell us about the journey to founding Bluerisk and the specific gap you're filling right now.
Sure, happy to, and thanks for having me. So prior to starting Bluerisk, I spent 9 years at a think tank called the World Resources Institute. It's a global environmental think tank. And during my time there, we were asked to develop a tool, a screening tool to help multinational companies. I'm talking, 15, kind of 20 years ago, start to understand where and why freshwater may pose a risk to their business, to their bottom line, right? So we built a tool called the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas. It's widely used around the world right now. It's a geospatial tool. You can upload, hundreds of facilities at a time and map those facilities against indicators of water risk. Great, fantastic tool. And similar to Gert-Jan, I became a little bit impatient because I felt like we were talking about risk so much, right? And talking about risk is fantastic. You need to build awareness. It's a critical stepping stone to taking action. But I felt there was a growing demand for basically helping companies move from understanding risk to really addressing that risk through very practical, simple, and actionable solutions. And I believe that those solutions are out there. There are plenty of very smart people and organizations with amazing solutions to help tackle some of these very complex problems related to water. So after 9 years at WRI, I basically left and started what is now Bluerisk. We're an advisory services company, and we really focus on helping organizations, mostly companies. We mostly work for multinational corporations, do three things. One, really understand where and why freshwater may represent a business risk to you. Very important to think about this holistically. So we look at the full value chain, right? There's been a lot of work done for what a company owns and operates, right? Their facilities, but many times water represents an indirect risk in their supply chain or in the consumer markets they service. So we really start by taking that holistic view of their entire value chain and their risk profile and being able to quantify and understand where risk is relevant to them. Once you know what and where and why there's risk, you can start to think about what's my role in addressing that, right? What can I do? What do I do through partnerships? What do I do in my operations? What do I do in the markets I service? What do I do in my supply chain with my suppliers? So we really help companies design and develop strategies to address those risks. Those typically include targets and goals, right, for what to aim to in the short term, right? So you can really get down to very practical, measurable objectives for what to do to address those risks. And then lastly, for many of our clients, we help them implement those strategies to meet their commitments. And that's because your strategy is only going to be as valuable as successful the implementation is, right? Having a strategy is great, but having it on your shelf in your office isn't going to change the world, right? You need to implement it, you need to deploy it, and you need to do it right. And that's very, very hard for water. For many reasons, right? Water issues are very local, very complex. It's regulated and governed differently in every country, and in some cases in every state within a country, right? So it's very unique, and therefore there are a lot of opportunities to help companies deploy these programs in a way that really creates value for them and the communities that they serve surrounding their companies. Yeah.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about your most recent project, helping to tackle water displacement and urban flooding in Madrid. The Valdebebas project is essentially turning a new residential neighborhood into a giant rainwater capture system. Can you walk us through what that looks like from the moment rain hits the ground to it replenishing the local stream?
We definitely can. And I think Madrid is the perfect showcase of what Paul just explained, how we operate, how we work. And basically, starting with the challenge in Madrid. Madrid faces huge water challenges due to the climate in that part of Spain. It is dry for very long periods, and when it rains a lot. But then it gets dry again for a long period. So the challenge is to capture the water and use it as good as you possibly can when it falls. What we've done is together create a winning coalition for a very large water solution in a new part of town. And when you build new houses, like the city of Madrid wanted to do, you have to make sure that the water situation that you disturb with a new neighborhood is getting in shape again. And becoming sustainable and resilient for decades to come. And that's where we started. We looked at Paul's clients that have an interest to mitigate their water risks in Madrid. And in this case, that turned out to be Microsoft. That's where it started. And then we formed a winning coalition. So Microsoft, the city of Madrid, the University of Madrid, which was heavily researching water challenges in the city and the area. And we selected the winning technology, which happened to be a Delft University startup called Field Factors. And we brought all those parties together. And in I would say record amount of time, designed the project from start to ready for installation with all the stakeholders involved, the water authorities, the city of Madrid, the University of Madrid, Paul and his team on the whole governance of the project, which is utterly important to make sure that anything we do in such a project is fact-based and is governed well. And we got Microsoft as the very, very important funder of making this all happen. And as a result, we now have a system that is being installed this year that will collect all the rainwater that will fall when it rains in that whole neighborhood. The water is collected to one location, is cleaned and treated, so that all the pollution and contamination is taken out. Then the water is, in this case, channeled all to a local river, which runs dry for the largest period of the year. And that is now going to be replenished by all the water from the neighborhood. And by doing so, we make a big shift for the whole water ecosystem in the city of Madrid. So rather than disturbing the water cycle, we now improve by this project and help Madrid deal with their water challenges in a very, very sustainable manner, all funded by Microsoft in this case.
I mean, that's incredible. So if effectively with new developments, they could actually, for once, improve the water situation rather than having to make it worse, which has been kind of the sort of recent history in terms of new housing development.
Exactly.
So one question I've got in terms of this particular project, so obviously that's going in now, it's incredibly, amazingly quick. It's outstanding that you guys have got to the point where you're like implementing the system so quickly. What's the project look like from your perspective in the future? Do you stay with it? Are you monitoring results for the next few things? Is there a sort of phased approach where you might add to it more or get involved in further development? So what does the next couple of years after installation might look like?
Well, I think you're best positioned to answer that question.
Sure. So for a project like this, what we would typically see and what we'd typically recommend is that a company be involved at least for a number of years to ensure that the project is performing as designed. So we'll be looking at a few things. Obviously, we'd want to look at the measurable outputs, right, of the project. Has that water been diverted from what otherwise, would have gone, somewhere else to, like Gert-Jan was saying, really improved in this case, the receiving water body to provide that base flow, that habitat. So we'd look at that measured output in terms of volume improved over time. But then what we'd also want to look at is performance factors, other performance factors that dictate whether or not the project is being successful and is implemented and functioning as designed. And performance factors may vary by project type. In a case like this, we'd probably want to make sure that the technology is working, right? That the monitoring systems are working. So if there are anything that needs maintenance or improvements, that's being deployed, that all parties are still involved. So we'd be looking at that for a period of 10 years. At that point, typically we'd ask a corporate sponsor, in this case like Microsoft, whether they want to stay involved or whether there's an opportunity to hand that project off to the authorities, right? In this case, in the city of Madrid, that could take over some of that moving forward. So it really depends on a project by project basis. But in this case, my guess would be that, in 8 to 10 years, we'd start to have a conversation with the local authorities to see if they're in a position to take it over, to give that project continuity and ensure that those benefits are being delivered for the really long term, not just those first 10 years where a corporate sponsor is involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Jess, we sorry to interrupt. The whole system is cloud steered. So every cubic meter of water that is saved and cleaned and stored is measured and reported. So over that period of 10 years, we know exactly the water volumes that we are replenishing through this solution.
And that's what's amazing by having that kind of oversight, because we are at the frontier of doing this kind of projects and improvement. You're able to then take whatever insights that you've gained and put that learning into the next projects that you do for anywhere else. For example, you've already done this obviously with the Sparta football stadium, Rotterdam, capturing 20,000 cubic meters of rainwater and replacing 15 million litres of drinking water used annually for pitch irrigation. So how different is scaling from a stadium to an entire residential development such as the one in Madrid?
It is, in many ways, every project is a challenge in itself because it's new stakeholders, new water authorities. So forming the winning coalition is always a new challenge. But I think we've become rather good at it. We know how to play this game, and we know how together we form the winning coalition for any location on Earth, with any technology it takes to solve the local water challenges. So we always look at what is the local challenge, what is the water ecosystem looking like, and which technology is the winning technology for that local water challenge. And that's what we always try to compose, and then get all the relevant stakeholders on board to act.
Yeah, just to build on that. So I think maybe our approach to building these winning coalitions and to finding the right solution that's place-based is a similar approach. But like Gert-Jan said, the nuance of who you're going to involve and when and why and how is all going to be project specific. But we do have an approach that's really grounded, like Gert-Jan said, in understanding the catchment context. What are the pressure points? What needs to be solved? And then based on that, who needs to be involved and what's the best technology out there to achieve that. And sometimes it may not be technology. Sometimes we may be looking at, nature-based solutions or other types of interventions.
Amazing. I mean, it's such an interesting thing, I think, with any kind of, technology implementation to anything. People, thinking about the people is so important. It's such a big part of anything you do to make these projects successful. And so having a approach, even if that's flexible and changes in the fact that that's being looked at, is so, I think, so important when you go into these kinds of projects. With a sort of smaller scale projects, how do you bring a team like that together? Is it just sort of more one-on-one with the stadium that wanted to help Sparta Stadium? Was it more one-on-one with them, or is there still quite a group of people that you bring together to achieve the results?
Well, you could say the soccer stadium was a big training ground for us, because we used it to learn how to run a project like this, and also to prove that we were able to deliver. And that project is now helping the Premier League club of Sparta to irrigate their pitches, even when it gets really dry for long periods of time. So it allowed us to prove that we are capable in a harsh environment, because this stadium is in the old city center of Rotterdam, which is a concrete arena. It's a concrete area, and all the water that lands in that concrete part of the city is captured, is cleaned, and then used for irrigation of the pitches. And we are now able to replicate this setup. In all places of the world. We're looking at Mexico, we're looking at Asia, Qatar, but always starting with what is the local water challenges looking like, and what is the appropriate solution to work on it.
Amazing. How do you go about involving and convincing corporate sponsors like Microsoft that getting involved in improving the water supply is good for business? Can you make a use case for businesses everywhere, or is it more case specific?
Yep. So maybe to the first part of your question, how do you get companies involved? I think we've seen a huge shift over the past 10 years. When I started working with the private sector on this, typically companies got involved much more from a philanthropic perspective, right? Their foundation would allocate resources and issue grants to organizations working on water or water access, right? Over the past 10 years, we've seen a huge shift, right? From water is something philanthropic, kind of corporate social responsibility, to saying, no, water is absolutely strategic for my business, right? So I would say the first thing you need to involve a company is, water needs to be very relevant to their bottom line, right? And typically, words used by kind of financial services industry is like materiality, right? Water is financially material to the bottom line of the company, right? So that's the first thing. You'd also want to make sure that the company has awareness of that financial materiality. There are many companies for which water may be financially relevant, but they haven't spent the time assessing it or quantifying that risk or understanding where and how water is a strategic issue for them. So you want it to be relevant to the company. You want there to be good internal awareness around what the issues are and where they're relevant. And then lastly, you need to have internal buy-in to want to tackle that. Right. And that's also something that seems obvious, but it's not always the case. Water in many places is seen as a compliance issue, right? Am I paying for the water that comes into the tap to my factory? Am I paying the third-party wastewater treatment provider, right? Yes, you are. You're complying with your water permits, your effluent permits. Good. I'm done, right? I no longer have a water problem. And that could not be farther from the truth, right? Water-related risks are grounded in the external context surrounding a company's facilities and their footprint, right? So you really need to take a much more proactive approach in understanding risk and understanding your dependency, understanding what could be done about it, and then having that internal buy-in and commitment. I would say for large companies at the board level, definitely at the C-suite level, because that's the only thing that's going to unlock the resources needed to deploy solutions to address those risks. So if you want to bring a company to the table in one of these winning coalitions to really make a difference at a landscape level on water resources, you need those three things in place. It needs to be relevant to their bottom line, right? Like a company like Microsoft that's running data centers, right, that needs water. There needs to be awareness of that, right? The company needs to understand those risks, and then there needs to be internal buy-in from the company. Many times a good indicator of that is whether or not the company has a target or goal to contribute to the surrounding watersheds. And thankfully, companies like Microsoft and many others do have very bold and ambitious goals to do this. So that's extremely helpful. So I'd look for those three things. Tasha, in terms of your second part of the question, right? Is there always a business case? No. Huge no. Capital letters, no. Right. Water is, the issues are very place-based. And I think it's important that we educate stakeholders around this. We're not asking large companies to, make large investments in water everywhere they operate. What we're asking them is to understand where water is most critical to their business, right? And focus there. Start there. Start in one or two places where you can make a big difference. You can demonstrate value to your stakeholders and to your company. You can build resiliency for your business. You can protect your bottom line, right? And start there. That's where the business case is going to be strongest, and where companies are going to be most willing to spend money and spend time contributing to these solutions and participating in these coalitions like Gert-Jan's mentioning. So I would say big capital no, start where it matters most, where the risk is greatest, and then go from there.
Yeah. A practical example, if I may, is I'm requested as a speaker on a data center water summit in Malaysia next month, where the construction of new data centers, which is urgently needed there, was postponed for a year because of lack of water. There was a long dry period around the capital, Kuala Lumpur. And for that reason, the government stopped all construction activities of new data centers. So then the business case is pretty easy to find. If you solve the water challenge, then your whole expansion plan can go on.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a kind of a timing? So from a corporate, say you're on the corporate side, and timing is important to start thinking about these issues, because you gave an example that was a really good example, but they'd already got stopped. So it's already caused a delay. And obviously there's a sense that you've got to then put in a project quite quickly. What would you say to companies that maybe haven't got that imminent thing happening to them straight away, why it might be worth giving yourself enough time to think about it?
Timing is everything, Jess. Absolutely everything. However, different risks manifest on different time steps, and some companies have already, some more mature companies in very mature sectors, right? Those sectors have been developed over hundreds of years, right? So many of these assets have been built and have been operating for millions of years. What's happened is the external context has changed. Right. So in that case, you're almost kind of reacting to a changing environment and adapting, right, to a more scarce environment. The hyperscaler data center industry is the opposite. It's an emerging sector, right? They're just starting, right? So in their case, being very proactive, starting very, very early is critical, right? Like Gert-Jan said, okay, we're going into a new geography, right? What's the water supply reliability like, right? What's the infrastructure conditions? What's the social sentiment, right, around our sector? Very important to do it early. Not all sectors have that luxury, right? Because they've been in place for a long time. So I think it's probably sector specific. And I think with Gert-Jan, we're working with both sectors that are highly embedded into a certain geography and have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now they're doing their best to adapt, right, to that changing external context. And then others that are newcomers, and they're trying to get ahead of it and help and contribute to building resiliency so that they can then, have a presence there for the long term. Gert-Jan, do you want to add to that?
Definitely. I mean, I think, Jess, you addressed a really tough issue when it comes to water investments. And to give you a practical example of the country where I live, the Netherlands, in our country, water is still extremely cheap. So because of the low cost of water, companies are tending not to invest in water technology and water stewardship. But in a growing part of the country, the large water utilities are no longer to deliver the quantities and the volumes of water needed by their clients. And that is only getting worse with climate change kicking in. So if you are a business, if you are a company and you consume a lot of water, you will not automatically get a new contract for your next decade water volumes from those water utilities. So even though water is cheap and you pay a very low price for your water bill of your large volume that you consume every month, you should not wait until you're with your back against the wall and your water utility will not renew your contract for your water supply for the next 10 years. So that's where timing is becoming more and more and more important. Don't wait too long, and start to build on your continuity, as Paul just explained, before it is too late.
And I think that's probably going to be in the future what separates businesses that are very successful still in the changing circumstances and those that fail because they future-proofed before the others did. There's a John Hopkins stat that for every 1% increase in impervious surfaces, roads, car parks, pavements, flooding goes up 3.3%. Most cities are heading in the wrong direction. So how do you make the case to developers that this should be standard, not optional?
Again, that's a very good question, Jess, with an easy answer. But I'm afraid that easy answer is not yet our daily reality. The easy answer is regulation. Governments should start to create regulation to make sure that we adapt our infrastructure privately. Whether we, it's in your home or my home, in our backyard, or businesses or cities. The Belgians did a good job. They were one of the most water exposed countries in the world, and they have created legislation that forces every household, every private Belgian, to have a water buffer installed on their own yard, on their own ground, as well as the obligation to reuse rainwater for flushing your toilets if you build a new home. And as a result, there is less flooding and there is a reduced consumption of water per head in the entire country. So that is what legislation can do if you have the guts as a government to do so. But unfortunately, Belgium is an exception. And well, as long as it is not a must-have with regulations forcing you, I would say if you are a city or if you are a private company, look at the business case, look at the cost for society, look at the cost for your city, and start to make the necessary investments. And compared to the potential damage, they're relatively low. But you have to do it. There's at the end, no choice not to do it. It's a little bit like Henry Kissinger said: what you have to do eventually, you must do immediately. And I think that's applicable here.
Absolutely.
And on that note, the UK is currently expanding a lot in terms of new housing developments, but the land that's being made available for it is frequently marshland or has a high floodplain risk. Do your water solutions offer kind of availability for where there's almost too much water rather than too little or an irregular amount?
Yeah, I think the perfect system strikes hits both targets. If you install the city that we installed in Madrid, for example, it collects the rainwater, it cleans it and it captures it. And by doing so, you act on water scarcity and restoring the local water ecosystem, but you also create a huge rainwater buffer and drainage capacity. So rather than flushing all that water into a sewage network that cannot cope with it when it's raining a lot, you create an additional drainage capacity. So by installing that large rainwater collection system, we address both the scarcity in the city as well as the flood risk in that neighborhood.
Sounds like we need some more. But the City of Madrid is collecting data over 10 years, as you mentioned, to apply findings to future developments like Operation Camp and Madrid Nuevo Norte, What would success look like a decade from now, and where will you go on from here?
A few ideas, and then Gert-Jan, you can weigh in. I think for a city like Madrid, or I think any city and potentially any company as well, I think there's three things that you want to have in place to successfully manage your dependency on water resources. One, robust water data collection and accounting, right? You need to be able to understand your water balance and extremes, right? Too much and too little, and provide those very robust and thorough quantitative estimates, right, to support objective decision making. So that's the first, I would say, robust data collection and water accounting systems. Two, a clear understanding of limits and thresholds, right, that we need to operate within, whether it's quality or quantity or extremes, right? What are the thresholds for us to deploy contingency plans, right? What are the limits of demand to ensure that we're operating within what is sustainable for that location? And how do you do that in a way that incorporates uncertainty moving forward, so we really build in resiliency in how we develop our infrastructure and manage our water, right? So that's the second. And then the last one is mechanisms to encourage operating within those limits, right? How do you incentivize behavior to stay within those thresholds, within those limits, and do so in a way that really, really maximizes the value of water? And I think that is fundamental, whether you're a city or a company or a country, right? Stand the data, understand your water balance and extreme weather events. How is that going to change over time? Two, what are the limits that we need to operate within? And then three, what mechanisms do we have, right, to ensure we stay within those limits and really optimize for value creation for every drop of water that you have available, whether that be for companies, for domestic users, for agriculture, and or for nature. So anyway, to me, that's what a winning menu looks like. But it is a high bar. It's difficult to achieve, but cities like Madrid and others are making fantastic progress towards that. Gert-Jan, do you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right about that, Paul. What I would like to add is learn and experiment, because the challenges when it comes to climate and water are so huge that we need to radically apply new technologies and do things in a radically different way, and that can only be done by learning and experimenting and continuously improve the way we create our water ecosystems. And Madrid already did a small scale project with the technology that we now apply in the new neighborhood. So they started learning and discovering the value and the power of that system in a smaller project. And then with the coalition that we created, we're able to deploy it now to an entire neighborhood. So it's a matter of getting started, having the guts to experiment with new, radical, better innovations, learn from them, and then scale them up faster. And that's what Paul and I are doing. We are now working on projects in Mexico. We look at Indonesia with huge water challenges, and we use the lessons we learned in Madrid or in Rotterdam with the example of the stadium, and ensure that we create better ecosystems in Mexico or in Jakarta.
And it's interesting you said that having guts and taking a little bit of risk to try things out and having a sensibility to try different things. You've obviously talked about how quickly these projects can move when the stars align, but for CEOs or developers maybe listening to this podcast, what does a potential partner need to have in place on day one? What does their good look like? Is it a specific set of data, a certain internal culture, or perhaps a shift in how they value their assets to ensure a project like this doesn't just start, but succeeds as rapidly as some of your recent projects?
Yeah, I think, Jess, it's a combination of a little bit of what the examples you gave. I think winning partners for us typically have three things in place when we bring them to the table. They have a clear understanding of what are we trying to achieve? What's my objective, for the city of Rotterdam or for my facilities in Mexico or my new factory going in Arizona? What am I trying to achieve in that place? That's very much informed by the company's water-related risks and dependencies at that location, right? So that's those two things are a must. How do I depend on water? How do I interact in water in that location? And based on that, what am I trying to achieve? There needs to be internal alignment and clarity on what my objectives are, so what a good deal is and what it isn't, what a good project is for you to support and which one isn't. Because there are a lot of things a company could get involved with, right? And you want to make sure it's the right one.
Mm.
And then lastly, how am I going to participate, right? What's the most cost-effective pathway for me to address those risks and dependencies and build resiliency at that location, right? What budget do I have available? What am I looking to get out of it? And how am I going to measure it, right? What are my timelines? And what's my long-term plan for monitoring, right, that project? If you don't have clarity around those things, it's very difficult for Gert-Jan and myself to bring you into a deal because we're moving fast and the solution providers are moving fast. And, the regulators have expectations that these things happen quickly, right? So if you want to be part of it, come into the table with those things, right? I understand my risk. I understand my objective for that city. I have internal buy-in on a timeline, on a budget, on a KPI that I need to report on, and my involvement over the long term. If those things are there, things can happen super quickly. And I think, Gert-Jan, all the examples you gave of projects we're working on, those were all there.
Absolutely.
Right? My clients come to the table saying, we've figured out what we want, why we want it, and how we're going to do it. We're just looking for winning partners, right? And it's amazing how quickly things move and how quickly you can do deals if those things are in place.
Well, I guess with a strong purpose, it's going to happen quickly. So it's good to know what all the pieces are that requires to create this sort of compelling vision. It turns what could be a crisis into a massive opportunity for better urban living.
It really does. Paul, Gert-Jan, thank you both so much for being so generous with your time today, not just for sharing the data, but for giving us a look under the bonnet of how these projects actually come to life.
Thank you
My
for
pleasure.
being part of the show.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to share a little bit on the fun that we have in working on this challenge.
What a fascinating conversation. What struck me most there is that we really don't need to wait for a miracle of physics to address the climate change that we face.
Exactly. And I guess that's what's we're all so passionate about at Beacon, is like constantly looking at what's the frontier, the new technologies out there, and how can we help, whether that's end consumers and customers, governments, businesses, use that new technology to make a real big difference to their lives. And that's how we like to work with our clients in terms of how do we get that technology into the hands of people who really, really need it. And as you heard today, you simply cannot have a conversation about future-proofing a project without talking about water.
Absolutely. It's that intersection of strategy and real-world impact that we live in every day at the agency. If you want to see more of how we're connecting these dots, you can find us at beaconagency.co.uk.
But for now, the takeaway is clear. The data exists and the technology works. If you're a developer or a business leader listening to this, water is no longer a background issue. It is the very ground you're building on.
We've put links to the Val de Bebas project and the Bluerisk tools in our show notes.
This has been a very special Earth Day edition of the Smart Life podcast. If you found this vital, please do share it and subscribe to get our next episode.
I'm Natasha Lydon.
And I'm Jess Hadley. Thank you for listening.